before we pass the torch to her, I want to say thanks for joining us. If you're just waking up in the US, want to say good morning, I guess. And for any questions you get just tuned in, you can use the YouTube chat to ask any questions to Bonnie regarding her talk, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end of the talk. And for the rest of the talks that we're going to be having at the in the future, please continue subscribing so you don't miss anything and you're notified right before its talk gets live. So sorry for taking a little bit of time there, Bonnie. I'll pass it on to you. So yeah. Thank you for listening to me.
Thanks, Stavros. Always a pleasure. And I was going to do the same thing. I was going to say good morning to people in the Western US like me who have just woken up or perhaps are watching this later. And good evening to people in Europe and everybody in between. So thank you for coming to this talk about React Query and Auth. So these two have some overlap. And it's not obvious who is responsible for what, and that's what I'm going to address in this talk. First, I'll introduce myself. My name is Bonnie Schulkin. I've been in the software industry about 20 years, and I've held a lot of roles, but currently I am a developer and a trainer. I have been focusing on writing Udemy courses. You can find me at my website, bonnie.dev, which is also on the bottom of each of these slides. At Twitter, I'm bonnie.dev with dots spelled out. And GitHub, I am extremely proud of having snagged the handle Bonnie on GitHub. Some introductory notes for this talk. I'm going to be talking about concepts mostly and not code. But I will have a link to a code example at the end. And this is a roll your own approach. So we're going to be really getting into the weeds about who's going to be doing what. And that is great for understanding all of the pieces, all of the players here. If you like to follow along with slides, you can go to bonnie.dev/talks. You can find this talk, which I think will either be at the top or depending on your time zone might be shifted to I've already done it. And there's a link to slides. All right, I've included some images that are sort of puns here in this talk, so you can keep an eye out for them. Here's one that's a table for a table of contents. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce React Query for those of you who might not be familiar with it. Then I'll talk about the assumptions for the app for this talk, how it's doing auth and so forth. Then I'll go into how I solved this problem of merging React Query with auth. And then I'll talk about a couple of NPM libraries that have taken different approaches. So let's talk about React Query. It is a really great library. If you haven't used it, I would highly recommend that you check it out. Its job is to maintain server state on the client. And the way it does that is it maintains a cache of server data on the client. One of its main features is the useQuery hook. And this hook takes a query function, and that's the function that's going to actually be getting the data from the server. So it could be a fetch or an Axios call. Then your React app can subscribe to the data by running the useQuery hook. And it'll get the data from the cache instead of getting it directly from the server. One of the benefits is it's now React Query's job to keep the data in sync with the server. So useQuery will update the data from the server for a variety of triggers. And some of them are automatic, like when the network reconnects or when the component mounts. You can also manually invalidate the data in the cache. So you can tell React Query that I don't think this data is up to date with the server anymore. I'd like you to fetch up-to-date data. And then I have a little bit of small print. React Query is complicated enough that I can't discuss all of it in this talk. So there are other concepts like stale data and cache expiration that I'm not getting into here. A couple of other React Query concepts that I'm going to be discussing in this talk. One is mutations. So mutations are not simply getting data from the server like queries, but they're actually updating data on the server. This is relevant for Auth because a user can update their data. They can update their email, or they can update their name, or so forth. There's also a concept of dependent queries that can be turned on or off based on the value of an expression. You can give a query an expression, and if that expression is truthy, then the query will be enabled. And if it's falsy, then the query will be disabled. This is important because if we don't have a user ID, we're not going to be able to fetch user data from the server. We need to know who the user is in order to fetch the data. So as far as the app, that's the backdrop for this talk, I have this day spa app where you can get massages or facials or scrubs. This was a very soothing app for me to write. And this app needs to communicate with the server. It needs to communicate with the server to get data, for example, to get data on what kinds of treatments there are, or who the staff is, or what the available appointments are. And for that, it uses React Query. It also needs to communicate with the server for auth. And for that, there's a useAuth hook. Let's talk a little bit more about that hook, which is custom to this app. So the useAuth hook provides sign in, sign up, and sign out methods. And those can be used by, say, the nav bar when somebody clicks sign in. Authentication for this app is being done by a JSON web token on the server. And when the sign in or sign up is invoked from the useAuth hook, then the app will receive in the response a token and the user data. And the token is what's used to pass to the server to prove that this user is who they say they are. So who owns this data? Is this client state or is this server state? And the answer is it's a little bit of both, which is why this topic is so complicated. The client state is which user is signed in. So the server doesn't know which user is signed in on every individual client. That's something for the client to keep track of. But the user data, the details for the user, that is server state. That's not something that the client is responsible for. So those are two owners of parts of user data. useAuth receives the user data, and then the user data has another owner. If you want to persist across sessions, you're going to want to store it in the browser storage so that when the user refreshes the page, for example, they aren't logged out. useQuery can be responsible for maintaining the updated data for the user from the server, but as I mentioned before, it needs the user ID in order to get the data from the server. It needs to tell the server which user it's looking for data. And I have a chicken and egg here because you can't get the ID until you have the user data, but you can't get the user data until you have the ID. So this is an issue that we're going to have to address as well. Now, you might look at that chicken and egg situation and say, that looks pretty complicated. Why are we involving React Query at all? Why don't we just use a context to store the user data and who's logged in and not even bring React Query into it? I have a couple reasons why React Query is good to have when you're dealing with user data, is good to involve when you're dealing with user data. The first one is those mutations. So the user can update the data, and we want to make sure that the data in the client, that the React app is showing the most recent data from the server. Let's consider a situation where the user updates, let's say, their email. And then there's a network error, or somebody made an error when they were programming the server, and it prevents an update on the server. The user, the React user, needs to know what the actual state of data on the server is. They need to know whether or not their update took place. And with React Query, you can invalidate the query. You can take that manual action to make sure that React Query fetches the most recent data from the server so that you know you are reflecting exactly what is on the server when people are looking at the app. And this, of course, will update the data as long as we are getting our data all from the same source for all components that are subscribed to this cache. So that includes, say, the nav bar, if you have the email posted on the nav bar to indicate which user is logged in. So mutations are a potential change to the data on the server, and we want to make sure after the mutation that all components are showing the exact state on the server. The second reason it's good to use React Query, to involve React Query in the user data, is for startup. So the app is going to be using local storage to maintain that login in case the user closes the browser tab and then logs in on another browser tab or refreshes the page. So there's a sort of minor thing. If the user updated the data from another browser or from another tab, we want to make sure that this instance of the app is up to date. And React Query can help with that. But even more important, what if the data changed on the server between sessions? And particularly if the authorization changed. So imagine for our spa app, there's a privileged user who's an employee of the spa, and they can add treatments. And then let's say this employee, did something egregious and got fired. And we want to make sure that they are no longer authorized. So whenever the app starts up, we're going to grab the former login information from local storage, but we want to immediately check on the server to make sure that we have the most up-to-date user data on the server. And React Query can help with this. All right, so maybe I've convinced you that we should be using React Query, but there are all those other getters and setters of the user data with useAuth and local storage. So are we going to have those subscribe to the React Query cache? Is that how they're going to get the data? And what about that chicken and egg situation about the user ID in the query function, where we need that user ID in order to query the server, but we need the user data in order to get the user ID? So here is the solution that I have come up with. And that is to centralize everything with a new hook called useUser. useUser is the source of truth. It tracks the user data with an internal state that is initialized by local storage. We keep the user up to date with the server by using that useQuery hook with React Query. And the way we can deal with that ID situation is if user is falsy, if there is no logged in user, then we can disable the query. We can deactivate the query. So we don't have to worry about the query going to the server without a user ID. Whenever the data updates, and the user data can update when somebody signs in, when somebody signs out, or if there's a mutation, the useUser hook is going to be responsible for making sure that everybody who needs to know about that update knows about that update. So it'll update the user state internally to the hook. It will update the React query cache it will update it manually by using the set query data, and it will update local storage. Now, I'm somebody who likes visuals, so visually, this looks like the useUser hook is in the middle. And it tells React Query what the ID is. The useUser hook will also be responsible for updating the cache if the data updates by something other than useQuery. And React Query will be responsible for giving useUser any updates from the server. The useAuth hook, when it gets the sign in or sign up data, it will tell the useUser hook so the useUser can inform everybody. And local storage. So local storage is where useUser gets the user when it initializes. And it also writes to local storage anytime the user data updates. The return values for useUser are that user state, that is the source of truth for the user data. And then updateUser, which takes user data, and that will make sure it updates all three places: the user state, local storage, and the user data in the React query cache. clearUser is the same thing, except it just removes everything. So this is what you'll do on sign out. You'll set the user to null, you'll remove the data from local storage, and you'll remove the data from the React query cache. To get into more details, this is what the responsibilities look like. So we're in every step, potentially we're going to have useAuth doing something, useUser communicating with local storage, useUser communicating with the local state, and useUser communicating with React query. So when the useUser call is first called by a component, the useUser retrieves the data from the local storage, and then it sets the user state, the local state from local storage. And if that user is not falsy, if it's truthy, it will React query will refresh the data from the server, because that's what happens when you first call use query. Then if the user signs in or signs up, useAuth will verify the sign in or sign up, and if it's valid, we'll call that updateUser that's returned from the useUser hook, which will be responsible for adding data to the local storage, updating the user, and adding the data to the cache. Now, the query also at this point will be enabled because user will be truthy. So now useQuery will update the data from the server whenever it's triggered. If the user updates their data, say on the user profile page, useAuth is not involved, useUser will update local storage and will update the user state. And then React query is going to manage that mutation. So it's going to call updateUser. And then we'll invalidate the data and refresh it from the server. Finally, when the user signs out, that's going to be initiated by useAuth. And here, so useAuth will call clearUser, which will remove the data from local storage. It'll set user to null. We'll also remove the data from the cache. And when user is set to null, the query is going to be disabled. So that's a lot of details. useUser has a lot of responsibility because it's responsible for making sure that all of the players know what's going on. If you'd like to see the code, you can go to GitHub here. And so go to this repository in GitHub, and you can go to completed apps. This spa is called Lazy Days Spa, and you can look at the client. So that's one approach. There are also NPM libraries that address React Query and Auth. And the first one is called, appropriately enough, React Query Auth. Here's a link to the package on NPM. This one is pretty lightweight wrapper around React Query. So as configuration, it takes functions for sign in, sign out, and sign up, the same type of functions that I have in the useAuth hook in my app. It uses a separate auth provider, and that auth provider returns a lot of different elements. So it returns the user data, which comes from the user cache, and then it also returns some functions to refetch user, to log in, log out, and register, which is what I'm calling sign up, and some information about when those are in process. It does something kind of interesting in that it treats sign in and sign up as mutation functions with React Query, and it updates the React Query cache on success. And the reason it uses mutation functions for those is useQuery is something that happens right when you call the useQuery hook. But useMutation actually returns a function that you can call whenever you want. It does not address persistence in the server, in the browser. It leaves that to you. And if you want to look at the data, you can follow this link here. So this approach updates the cache using mutation functions, using mutation function callbacks. There's also a React Query Firebase library. And so this is if you want to use Firebase as your auth. And this one actually uses useQuery for the auth calls. It wraps useQuery in a custom hook that runs the auth calls. So instead of the custom functions that I use in the useAuth. The query functions call the Firebase functions, and it stores all of the data directly in the React Query cache. Firebase itself manages the persistence with local storage or with session storage. And you can see the code following this link. Both of these libraries are still finding traction. So as of yesterday, we have 504 weekly downloads for React Query Auth and 32 weekly downloads for React Query Firebase. And you can compare that to React Query, which has over 500,000 weekly downloads. All right, so my conclusion is that basically the reason Auth is an interesting concept to talk about with React Query is that there are a lot of players who are interested in user data. One is React Query, another is the auth functions, and then finally this persistence across sessions, which I've been using local storage. And so any complete approach has to address all three. All right, I am now ready to open it up for questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Bonnie. I see one question from Douglas. Let me post it for you. I'm not sure if you checked the chat.
Yes, I can see.
But he's okay. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, I just posted right now. If you want to.
Yes. So, yes, thank you for this question. So, he says, would React query replace Node Express or any backend using REST or CRUD? And the answer is no. React query actually is, it interfaces with either REST or GraphQL. So those query functions that I mentioned, those are going to be hitting either REST or GraphQL endpoints in order to get the data from the server. So you still need to have a server and you still need to have endpoints to access the data. React Query's job is to make sure that the client has up-to-date data from the server without the client constantly having to pull the server by itself.
All right. Awesome. Thanks for going through that. So I think this is for this talk. If there's any questions, guys, that you want to ask Bonnie regarding the talk or pretty much anything else, feel free to reach out to her on every social media platform. Right? And or here, yes, or here in this video on YouTube, and she can go through it and of course reach back to you with an answer. So, all right, I think we'll be taking about a 10 to 15 minutes break. The next talk is 5 minutes to 12 for you guys in the US, from what I see here. So, yeah, I think we'll check back in about 15-ish minutes with Ishan. So again, thanks, Bonnie, for joining in and sharing all this information with us. And for the rest of you guys, we'll see you in about 15-ish minutes.
All right. Thanks, Stavros. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.